and welcome to the Zero Ends channel. Please like and subscribe. Please enjoy our live.
Continue of section chapter 8. This is section 2. Throughout these years and the next attempt by slaves, slightly or in a groups, to get into St. Augustine continues and where complain of frequently. Indeed, the evidence seems to indicate that the prevailing conditions approaching a state of actual warfare of guerrilla type, with as an official committee reports assassination, recurrence, great alarms, prevalence, and conspiracies uncovered, including one in Charlestown itself in 1738. The slaves seem to have been particularly active during the month of November of that year, and even inhabitants of Georgia were disturbing, some killed, by South Carolina slave fighting their way down into the promised land. This turmoil of discontent probably reached its climax in 1739, when several plots and uprisings rocked the providing of South Carolina. A journal entry of its Georgian for February 8 opens the story for this year. But what we heard told us by several newly come from Carolina was not to be disregarded. This of that epic conspiracy was formed by the Negroes in Carolina, in rising and forcibly makes their way out of the province to put themselves under the protection of the Spaniards. That this was first discovered at Wynyard, which is at the most northern part of the province, from wherever as they were to lead their course south. It argues that the other parts of the province must be purity to it, and that the rising was to be in this journal section universal, whereas upon the whole province were all on their guards, as you know, guarding. On February 20th, this same source refers to another conspiracy among the numerous slaves of two planters, Montague and de Bifiente, located on the banks of the Savannah within the district of Perrysburg, a little below that town. A new item of early March reports that a group composed of several Negroes and two whites, supposed to be a Spanish and an Irishman, had killed one white man and wounded three others in this troubled province. They were, however, beaten off by people coming and freeing on them from the neighborhoods, but they all made their escape and are gone clear as yet. On March 15th, a bill aimed at preventing slave insurrections was submitted to the legislature, and it was enacted on April the 11th, 1739. But the greatest uprising of the year was yet to occur. On a Sunday evening, September 9th, 1739, about a score of slaves at Stone, South Carolina, some 20 miles southwest of Charleston, led by one named Jimmy Rebellion, killed the, and there's a document here, and there's a contemporary for it, but let's go on. Two guards, a Mr. Bathrus and Mr. Gibbs, of a warehouse or magazine, belonging to a Mr. Hitchinson, and appropriating a pretty, manny small army and powdered and headed at a slow pace south, apparently aiming to reach St. Augustine. On the way, they killed all in their path, with the exception of an innkeeper by the name of Wallace, who they felt was a good man, kind to his slaves, and burned several buildings, 6 of 7, so that the country there about was full of flames. Other Negroes joined them until something like 75 or 80 slaves were guaranteed. They called out liberty, marched on with color display, and 2 drums beating. Colonel Bull, lieutenant governor of the province, chanced to, by riding near their line of march, saw them and immediately spread the alarm. Guards were posted at all ferries and roads, and the militants assembled and set out in pursuit. The Negroes whose activities have delayed them and who have been marching and fighting for 10 or 1,200 rested some 10 miles such of Simone or Stonio. Here they were met and attacked by a detachment of militants of approximately their own numbers, but probably better armed. An engagement ensued, wherein one fought for liberty and life, the other for their country and everything that was dear to them. The Negroes, though they behaved boldly, were defeated in the opening exchange of gunfire. The militants rode down 14 on the spot and pursued after them. Within 10 days, killed 20 odd more and took about 40 who were immediately some shot, some hung, and some gebbered or gebbet alive. A number came in were seized and discharged, and some are out yet, but we hope will soon be taken. Certainly the search and pursuit were maintained for some of these rebellions, were captured months later. The number of casualties resulting from the uprising are not precision known, but probably about 25 whites and twice the number of slaves were killed in the course of the uprising and its what they call suppressions. Early in June 1740, another major conspiracy was crashed in South Carolina. This time it in already or around Charlestown itself. A trader had given the slaveholders advance warning about 24 hours so that an armed force was pursued and it relentless for any trouble. On the day set for the outbreak, from the 150 to 200 slaves did get together in defiance, but as they were unapproved with arms and there was no corn on the ground rip for their substance, their deposition and subsequent capture were not difficult. At least 50 of the Negroes were caught and hanged in batches of 10 a day in order to intimize the other Negroes, or intimate the Negroes. And always every reading is a subtitle of a small print that goes into other subsections of this article, of this book. So when you get the book personally, you'll see them personally. So I'll let y'all read that when y'all get hold of this book personally. Let's continue. Later this same year, a terrific fire devastated Charlestown, destroying hundreds of buildings and necessarily an appeal to the other colonies for assistance. First report ascribed at the origins of the calamity to the slaves, but this was later denied, and it was decided that the fire had been caused by some accident. However, this may be several fires that broke out in the same community. The next year were definitely ascribed to the Negroes. A woman was condemned to die for the crimes of arsoning. In July, a man was burnt to death in Augustine as punishment for having set fires to a house with the evil intent to burn down the remaining parts of the town. And two slaves were held guilty of setting fires in December to the city magazines. In the midst of the rebellion, activities in the order to combat the unrest and the providence of South Carolina in 1739 and 1740 passed rather vague laws requiring better food and clothing for slaves and providing that they should not be working over 14 hours a day in a winter and 15 hours in summer. On the other hand, bounties for the scalps of runaway slaves were offered, and as a preventative measures, the colony also placed a truffle on import slaves and marking the revenue, so obtaining for a subsidy with which to encourage the settlings of protesting white people. Slaves sold very slow in 1740, and South Carolina import none until 1744. When the slaves trade of Bristol, England, complained, and the incredible business once more began, it was very largely the object lessened by the rebellion activities that led the leaders of the border colonies of Georgia, men like Oglethorpe, Stevens, Marty or Martine, and Egmont to institute and to maintain until 1750 a ban against slavery. During those years of excitement in South Carolina, other colonies were not free of a like danger. Thus, in the spring of 1738, several slaves broke out of jail in Prince George County, Maryland, united themselves with a group of outlying Negroes and proceeded to wage a small-scale guerrilla war, and the council of the colony decided that the magistrates of the affected areas had not exerted themselves sufficiently, and so instructed the sheriff to put down the trouble, empower him to use its necessary entire strength of the country or the county. Sorry. The next year, this council was present with the deposition of several citizens of that county, related to a most wicked and dangerous conspiracy having been formed by the slaves to destroy his majesty subjects within this province and to possess themselves of the whole county. This deposition said a considerable number of slaves were implicated. A letter from the leader of the province, lower house, Stephen Broadley, is more explicit. He's writing from Annapolis in Anne Ardell County on January 30th, 1739, asserting that about 200 slaves were directly implicated, that they had agreed upon a leader, a clever, sensible following between 40 and 50 years old, and planned to capture the town's magazines and the captives or the capital and establish their own government should they then be faced by overwhelming forces they intend to settle back in the woods. On the Sunday appointed for the revolt, a terrific storm occurred and the event was postponed for 2 weeks. At this point, a slave belonging to a Mr. Brooks betrayed the plot, and immediately measures of repression were taken, including the execution of at least one of the leading rebellions. Slaves in New York City were accused in 1740 of conspiring to kill their masters by poisoning the water supply. As a result of this, according to the one authority, most New Yorkers thereafter for quite some time bought spring water from vendors who carried it about the street. This fact indicates how strong was the suspicion and fear of the approximate 2,000 slaves among the 10,000 white inhabitants of the city. The fear and suspicion had full play, with tragedy resulting the next year. The hysteria or heresies of 1741 in the city of New York have been threatened by some historian as arising from a complete hoax or an unaccountable mob delusion, while others have dealt with the results from real and considerable slave conspiracies. Hysterias. Yeah. It seems fairly certain that neither those views altogether coincide with the fact. It does appear clearly that discontent among the poor Negroes and whites was rifle. On the other hand, the existence of a plot was doubted by contemporaries, and the severity of the punishment was decried by some among them. The fullest first-hand accounts of events was written by Daniel Horsemenden, whose position as recording made him prosecutors of the alleged conspiracies or conspirators, and it was produced in parts of order to justify the city proceedings. Horsemenden certainly exaggerate the seriousness of disaffection. Indeed, by his own accounts, the star witness against the conspirators, a white woman named Mary Burton, was a bold liar, so that even the court finally disregard her wild story, and the methods by which confessions were extracted, that is, by promise, by reward, or by use of torture, cast grave doubts as to their reliability. The period was once, however, of distrust for the inhabitants of the city. An unpopular war against Spain was then in progress in winter of 1740 and 1741. Had been usually severely being remembered for years as the hard riders and suffering amongst the poor slaves and the freed was intense. The price of wheat was very high, leading early in the spring of 1741 to a general combination of the bakers not to bake until the price fell, which occasionally some disturbance and reduced some, notwithstanding their riches, to a want of bread. Fire, moreover, were extreme or exceedingly frequent, particularly during March and April, and of suspicious origins of affecting not only private housing, but the governor house, the secretary office, and the king of chapel, and the barracks of the soldiers. Many contemporaries were convinced that some, at least, were set by Negro slaves and white accomplices, and some of the testimonies offered at the trial concerning disaffection rings true. Indeed, the governor of the province declared on June 20th, if the truth were ever known, there are not many innocent Negro men, and it is thought that some Negroes of the county are accomplices and were to act their part there. This last idea probably arose from the fact that late in April, several suspicious fires occurred in Hackensack, New Jersey, for which at least 2 slaves were executed by burning on the 5th of May. Concerning the terrible results in human terms of the mass hysterias, there can be no doubt about 150 slaves and 25 whites, including 17 soldiers, were arrested for whites and innkeepers John Hugson's, his wife Sarah, and women of unsavory reputations and various names through usual reference to a Margaret Carey and a man held to be a Spanish priest, John Uri, were executed. Of the slaves arrested, 13 were burned alive, 18 were hanged, 2 in chains, and 70 banished. 7 slaves and had been indicted were never found. An entry in the Journal of the Council of South Carolina for April 13, 1744, indicates concerns over the problem of slave control, for on that day the government accept an offer of the Natchez Indians or Nacatee Indians to assist in the case of any insurrection or rebellion of Negroes. Occasionally to make use of this came in less than 3 months. On July 5th, the governor, James Glenn, having received a letter from a Captain Richard Wright, asked for the assistance of some Nacatee Indians in order to apprehend some runaway Negroes who had sheltered themselves in the woods and being armed had committed disorder in the neighborhoods, unifying the council that he had written to the chief of the Nacatee, asking his aid in destroying these rebel slaves whose continued existence was a very dangerous example for their brethren and subjects. There exists 2 tantalizing and complete reference to slaves conspiracy during 1747, through one is more definite than the other. The first has reference to South Carolina again and occurs in a letter from a distinguished native of that region, Henry Lauren, dated London, March 21st, 1748, and addressed to James Cowell. Mr. Lauren tells his friend of the recent arrival of the boat from South Carolina, bringing reports from the area up to January 27, 1748. There was nothing in particular importance among them, according to him, except confirmation of the account of the most heroic insurrections intended by the Negro there, which was prevalently discovered before any mischief done. And let me pause for a second. Now, I hear many times when people talk about said these Native Americans were tribes of Indians. And remember, there was many tribes of Native Americans during the time. They called forth from the pilgrims or the Caucasians of that time, where they asked for assistance to not only capture these slaves, but if they can catch, they kill them. Same way. So I want black people to have an understanding clear that the Native Americans back then, when they talk about they went in and were hunting you too, just to catch you, send you back into slavery. This is a true statement. There is no lie. The Native Americans, what type of tribe they were during that time, were not your friend. African people, black people. And it just prove it right there. So when people talk about today are Native American, and that's nice, but you didn't know those same people that you might have in your bloodline, either you put yourself in that mixing blood with them, they didn't like you. They were not your friends. While you try and fight for freedom and fight against the so-called oppression of them days, these same Native Americans work in there with the same people that took over their land, so-called their land, if this was really their land, and work hard to put you back in chains. Imagine that. Very sad. Very sad. But the truth gotta hurt sometime. But let me continue. The second has reference to New York, but is of a much more negative nature that occurred in a letter which is famous. Cadwallader Colden writes to his wife from New York City on April 18, 1747. He remarks, "There has been a new rumor of the rising of Negroes, but upon inquiring, no foundation can be found for it." So far as available records go, the next generation is one during which there was a marked decline on organized rebellion activities on the part of the Negro slaves. Precisely why this is so, the present writers is no certain, and many, however, he notes that acute economic depression or especially excitement events, with the exception of the French and Indian War, which had some effects of the slave, but which was largely confined to the North and the West, away from the slave areas, are generally lacking there these years. It is possible, too, that the rather strenuous activities indulged in during the previous 25 or 30 years and the ruthlessness and efficiencies with which it was suppressed had exhausting and cautionary effects upon the slave. It is an observable tendency in the history of this rebellion as a whole that they seem to come in spasms and spurts, with what may be termed breathing spell, rests upon period and varying lengths of intervening. Complete quiet, however, did not prevail. The evidence occurred unrest among Virginia and Maryland slaves in 1755 through 1756 during the French and Indian Wars, and especially after news of a defeat of the English and Mongolian had penetrated to the interior. Actually, it's pronounced the English at the Mahagabalba. I think it's certain territory, maybe. Has previously been presented. There are reports fragmentary and unsatisfactory, as it's so often the case, of fairly considerable disaffection from 1759 to 1761 in South Carolina. According to one careful historian, a serious attempt as revolt occurred in the former years. In this connection, there may be added significance to a message of a February 7, 1760, which the governor sent to his province house of assembly. He referenced to the presence of smallpox in a city and cite this to support his desire that the members return to their homes, where he went on, Your presence will at this time be particularly useful in case a due execution of the law of preserving the eternal quiet of the country from an attempt of Negroes or other persons to disturb it." The complaint of a South Carolina paper early in 1761 that the slaves had again began to hellish practice of poisoning seemed to indicate organized efforts at revenging on the parts of the Negroes. This same year, Providence adopted special police measures, and as of 1740 offers a bounty for the purpose of attracting white settlers. Maroons became troublesome in South Carolina again in 1765, and at least one considerable settlement of these rebels was broken up by the militants during the end of the year, reports. Of large-scale plots recurring on December 17, the Lieutenant Governor, William Bull, told the London Board of Trade that he, and said a few days ago, received information that some plot are formed and some attempt of insurrection to be made during these holidays. at which time slaves are allowed some day of festival, an exception from labor. I shall therefore take proper measures to prevent the execution of such designs by giving necessary direction in the militants and patrol to alert on their duty on that season. These indeed were not the only precautionary measurements taken for Indian friendly to the whites were brought into eastern South Carolina to terrorize the slaves and the whites settlers in the up country and even in North Carolina were as to be readily at the moment notice to march into the lower sections of South Carolina. These measures seem to have effectively checked any contemporary uprisings. Late in 1767, Negroes of the neighborhood of Alexandria, Virginia, put into practice a plan for rebellion. How many were involved is not known, but several overseers died from the effect of poison administration to them by slaves. Contemporary present reports that some of the Negroes have been taken up, 4 of them were executed about 3 weeks ago. After which their heads were cut off and fixed onto the chimneys of the courthouse. And it was expected that 4 more would soon meet the same fate. It is probably that the few of the execution slaves belonged to the eminent George Mason of Virginia. The next year, during which trouble arose because of the concerning efforts of rebellious Negroes, is 1771, and it affects areas of Georgia. On December 4th, the Council of Colonies was told by Governor James Habershon that he had received information that a great number of fugitive Negroes had committed many robberies and insults between this town, Savannah, and Ebezerd, and that their numbers, which were now considerable, might be expected to increase daily. That it apparently absolutely necessary to fall upon some spiritual measures to take and dispense them to prevent further inconvenience. The council decide it will be best to engage some Indians to go out that way hunting in order to discover the camp of the Negroes, and when they had so done, to order Captain Willie with parts of the company of the militant under the command to go in search of apparent them, and to empower him to give a small reward to said militants if any extreme or extraordinary duty should be required of them of this necessary service, to expense of which to be defrayed by the treasury. It further advised that the city of Savannah itself be most careful patrolling during the coming Christmas holidays, through what particular informations made this suggestion especially permanent does not appear. Similar to troubles in no less dangerous forms of reports, again within 6 months amongst the president of the Savannah grand jury in June 1772, brought to the attention of the government or the governor and the council, was one reporting that a number of fugitive slaves had assembled themselves on a near and border of the river Savannah, and are frequently committing depredation and the inhabitants of in that neighborhood with impunity, and that it said fugitive slaves did lately set fire to a dwelling house near Black Creek, in which the white child was burnt to death, and also that some slaves had lately stoked a boat belonging to Joan stricken upon the river and taken several articles of value. Therefore, also that some slaves being at the camp near Augustine Creek, being surprised by the Fedine, a white man did fire at the said Fedine. It was decided to direct the officer commanding the company of militants belonging to the 1st Northwest Division to send out patrols of men in quest of the said fugitive slaves on the main or on the island in the river within the patrol division on the said Kemple, and also that his honor and the governor will order the commander of the scout boat to go up the river Savannah and search the creek and search place on the river and islands as far as Ahocourt or Abercorn Creek in order to discover the take any of the said fugitive slaves or their boats. In that year of 1772, a Negro conspiracy was uncovered in the area around Petty Anthony, New Jersey, and center of slaves trade, and outbreaks of actual violence was prevented by the precautionary measures. And just how serious this plot was and not clear, it is on interest to note that the fear this arose stimulated at least one individual living in the effects regions to advocate at this early date the shipment of all the slaves to Africa at the expense of their owners. The conspiracy of slaves in September 1774 to liberate themselves by offering to fight with the British against the Bostonian and conditions that its successful freedom was to be there has already been mentioned, as has the fact that censorship cuts off further information. It is to be noted that this conspiracy coming in the midst of fierce debates in which the concept of natural rights, liberty, and equality largely figures stimulates thinking on the subject of Negro slaves, except just as the New Jersey plot 2 years before it had done, a Massachusetts commander, Abigail, the wife of John Adams, went further than did he of New Jersey, for she wrote, "I wish most sincerely there was not a slave in the province. It always appears a most inadequate schemes to me to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have a right to freedom as we have. You know my mind on this subject." In November 1774, several slaves, men and women, in St. Andrew Parish, Georgia, possibly stimulated by the excitement that was in the moment running through all the colonists rebelling, and before being subdued, killed 4 whites and wounded 3 others. Others than the fact that 2 of the slaves were burned alive for their part in the outbreak to punishment meant out of the rebellion as a whole is not recorded. During the first year of actual hostilities of the American Revolution, there occurs what appears to have been a serious plot in Bedford, Pitts, and Cavan counties, North Carolina. Contemporary reference to an account of these are generally few and merge, but there is one exception. A full and interesting description of the events was written in the midst of excitement by one of the participants in the drive to crush the unrest. On July 8th, a slave of Mr. Thayern and another belonging to a Captain Thomas Rispes told the later that on that very evening, an insurrection of the Negroes against the whole people was scheduled to occur. We immediately set off an expense to Turnbrook to alarm the inhabitants there. We had proceeded to business and appointed upward to 100 men in paroles, and passing a resolve that any Negro that should be destroyed should be paid for by a tax of the Negro in the country. We then separate the sound of alarms through the country and apprehend the suspicious heads by we had the custody and in gold, near 4 under proper guards. The following day, the committee sent and proceeded to examine into the affairs and find it a deep laid, horrid, tragic plan laid for destroying the inhabitants of this province. Without respect of person, age, or sex, it was discovered that a white man of northern boats, captain named Johnson, who had recently landed for a supply of unveiled stores and slave named Merck, a Bath and Bedford County, had propagated the contagion, and there were 5 Negroes whipped that day by order on July 10th to the committee. Ordered several to be several whippings and sentenced several to receive 80 lashes, each to have both ears cracked, which was executed in the presence of the committee and a great number of spectators. In the afternoon, we received an express from Col Blanc of Negroes being in the arms on the lines of Cameron and Pitts and pray assistance of arms and ammunition, which we readily granted. We posted guards upon the road for several miles that night. As often happened in these cases, exaggerating rumors of hundreds of armed slaves advanced every which way did fly. About one of them started by a slave woman who intended to kill her master and put the blame on one of their plantains' bodies, or the phantom bodies, sorry. Arms and ammunition were, however, found in the possession of several of the slaves, and that some of the least were killed by the patrol appeared in Mr. Simpson's remarks about one of his neighbors, that had he been a Martinborough, he would have received pay for his Negroes. The end of the letter, written 1 week after the plot exposing, shows that the work of repression was still going on for it read. We kept talking up, examining and searching more or less every day, from which every part of the county they all confess nearly the same thing, viva that they were one of all of the night of the 8th instant to fall on the destroy the families where they live. Then they proceed from house to house, burning as they went, until they arrived to the back country, where they were to be received with by a number of persons they appointed and armed by the government for their protection, and as the further award, they were to be settled in a free government of their own. During this same year, alarms arose because of the alleged concurrent activity of slaves in the province of New York, South Carolina, and Virginia, but none seem to have been important. One that in Virginia, where Governor DeMore justifies his seizure of powdering before the delegation of irate citizens led by Patrick Henry on the grounds that he had information of the Project Negro insurrection was almost certainly spurious. There were hints rather than actual accounts of disturbance among the slaves in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey in 1776. There is, for example, indirect evidence that the colony Stephen Bull of Georgia had written to Henry Lawrence of the South Carolina telling him of Negro unrest and planned for the execution of leading agitators among them. This is the evidence since the reply of Lauren State, Charlestown, March 16, 1776, refers to the receipts of such a communication and declares. Now for the grand, we may say, awful business contained in your letter. It is an awful business, notwithstanding it has this section of law to put even fugitives and rebellions, slaves to death, to prospect of horror. We think the Council of Safety in Georgia ought to give the encouragement which necessary induce proper person to seize of nothing else will be destroyed all these rebellion Negroes upon Tybee Island or wherever they may be found. And reference has already been made to the evidence of alarms among the inhabitants of Buck County, Pennsylvania, in the summer of this year, and the arrest of one slave, Sampson, considered to be the chief disturber of the master security during the same season, as appeared from another of these tantalizing incomplete letters. This from Samuel Tucker to John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress, dated Treasury, New Jersey, of July 5th, 1776. This is one day after America became America with Declaration of Independence. I think it was signed July the 4th, I believe. Like trouble appear on a more serious nature, bother Pennsylvania northern neighborhoods. Mr. Tucker told Mr. Hancock of various difficulties besetting the American cause in his region, and among these appear this sentence: the story of the Negroes may be dependent upon as, or so far at least, as to their arming and attempting to form themselves, particularly in Somerset County. Henry Lawrence, whose correspondence had already been twice called upon furnishing information about Negro uprisings, was once again the receipts of a letter of this subject in 1778. The information that this time in the Marquise de Lafayette writers of March 11 from Albany, New York, Lafayette, tell Mr. Lawrence that demoralization has filtered into the army ranks, for the soldier had gone without pay for a long time. He adds that he had recently received an anonymous letter entailing a plot in which slaves and soldiers were involved to burn the city of Albany and store magazines, buttocks, as soon as Rivers would open. The many officers of gentlemen were to be assassinated by their own Negroes, etc., etc., etc. But he had not been able to uncover anything definite. Further evidence of unrest among the approximate 4,000 slaves in Albany County, New York, from 1778 to 1780 have been referenced to early. Sufficient reference has also already been made to like difficulties in New Jersey and Georgia in 1779. In the decades of the 80s, there were a few reports of slave conspiracies, but the activities of Maroons seem to have been more important. A passage in the letter of July 21st, 1781, from a colony, what they call Wooding of Halifax County, Virginia, another officer asked for arms and predicament. He remarks that there were some good guns in the possession of private individuals, but they secretly then and say they will do it for their own defiance against insurrection of slaves, or Torres reasons that seem to carry weight, with me at least. In a letter of May 2nd, 1782, from Accomack County, Virginia, reference is made to conspire the Tories, British, and Negroes, but details are lacking. There are indications of a dangerous insurrection having been planned by slaves of Cumberland County in the same state in the spring of 1786. But early disclosures seem to have effectively blocked any actual uprising at that time. The Spanish province of Louisiana was seriously troubled from 1782 to 1784 by numerous rebellions, Maroons, and Negroes under the leadership of one called Saint Malo, an expedition succeeding and captured about 25 of those people, men and women, and their punishment varies from hanging to branding and receiving hundreds of lashes. Fuller information is available concerning like conduct in Virginia during approximately the same period. It is known for examples that a slave, Bill of Prince William County, was sentenced to death in May 1781, having been convicted, particularly enough for one in his status, of the crime of treason, and abating, and feloniously, I don't know if that's a new word, feloniously, traitorously waging and levying war against the Commonwealth in conjunction with drivers, enemies of the same, in the armed vessels. A letter of September 10th of this year from the residents of Accomack County seems to have reference to the same sort of things for which Bill was hanged. We have had most alarming times that summer all along the shores from the set of Bangors, Maine, mostly by our own Negroes who have run off. These felons are really dangerous to an individual singled out for their vengeance, whose property lays exposed. They burnt several houses. On August 30th, 1782, Edmund Randolph wrote James Madison of the alarming activities of the groups of whites and fugitive slaves numbering about 50 men whose attacks on the plantation in the native city county, Virginia, was seriously menace to life and property and communication, written 4 days later, and date points on Fork in the same state, declaring that runaway Negroes, joined by a few white men, have on later been doing mischief in the neighborhoods. The British had combated the revolutionist siege of Savannah with the aid of numerous bodies of Negroes, slaves who served under the inspiration of a promised freedom, and the final defeat of the English in this war crushed the hopes of these Negroes. They fled with their arms, called themselves soldiers of the King of England, and with a stockade village half a mile long over the 400 feet wide in the Belle Isles swamps from 20 miles north of Savannah, as their base carries on a guerrilla warfare for years along the Savannah River. Finally, in 1786, militants from Georgia and South Carolina, together with Indian allies, successfully attacked the Negroes settlement with results heavily casualties. Other camps of disparating fugitive slaves in Georgia were also attacked and reportedly destroyed during the following year. And in the legislation message delivered that year of 1787, the governor Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina reference was made to the seriousness determination of a group of armed Maroons in the southern part of the state. And that is the end of chapter 8, section 1 and 2. Actually, section 2 is the end of it. So this is the end of this chapter. Now, to my conclusion to this chapter, it's evident that a lot of battles were fought and lost and won during the Negro side of that time. But one thing is clear. It's evident proven that in this section, this chapter, this long chapter, that Indians or the Native Americans of that time were not Negroes' friends, particularly ADOS people, black people of that time. And nor the Negro fought very hard in the 1700s for his freedom. And he took many tactics. Majority guerrilla warfare was the name of the game of that time. And it took not only the United States of the militants of the time to fight back against the Negro, but they had help with the Native Americans too. So it made it much difficult for, I guess, black people of that time to fight back. Very challenging, but at times was not really too much difficult because, if you look at when America was still in its infant stage, people, it was still a fresh land. And it's really telling, really, of the myth that black people that either were brought here as slaves or here already knew the land pretty well. Because if they were able to initiate guerrilla warfare in a land that they didn't know, they had some knowledge of America territory. So I'm not sure when people give this myth that, these people were dumb, stupid, and they didn't know how to get around or survive during that time, during oppression, because they did not know the land. That is a lie. Because to inflict guerrilla warfare and to be hiding amongst not only regular militants, which are Europeans, Caucasian at that time, but also they were hiding and fighting and destroying them and potentially the Native Americans of that time too. So I hope this was very informative. I like to hear people's reactions at the end of this stream. Comments most likely. If you didn't like the video, please like the video. I would like y'all to be on the lookout for the next reading. But that's pretty much it. So I'd like to thank everybody that was listening to tonight's show. Thank you for it again. Until next time, we'll be continuing on to the chapter of this American Negro Slave Revolts. Till next time.